That night, right in the middle of the 30th anniversary ranch dinner, my son-in-law stood up, pointed his finger at my face in front of dozens of guests, and said, "Your time is over. Starting tomorrow, this ranch belongs to the new generation." Then the next morning, when I returned home, the lock on my own door had been replaced with a new one. I, the man who had built every fence post and poured every sack of cement for this land, had to sleep with the cattle in the barn through a rainy night. But they forgot one thing. Who really owned this house? And they ended up facing a bitter end. If you've ever been looked down on by your own family, kicked out of the place you built, or stayed silent to keep your dignity, stay until the end of this story. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or guns, but from a farmer who knows how to hold a pen and measure his boundaries again. Leave a single dot, if you believe the truth always finds its way home. And hit subscribe so you won't miss the stories where silence becomes the verdict, and dignity is the strongest weapon. At the end of summer, wind from the valley blew up the hill, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust. I stood under the ranch porch, looking across the field where the Angus herd quietly chewed cud, their small bells clinking together like whispers of the evening. On the long cedar table I had built myself back in 1994, Sabrina laid a cream-colored cloth, set jars of white daisies, and dropped slices of lemon into the water pitcher. "Dad, tonight's going to be cozy," she said, her eyes avoiding mine as if hiding something. I nodded, calm. 30 years of ranching, a long enough time to know that silence is sometimes the only way to hear your own voice. Guests arrived earlier than expected, not just neighbors, as I thought. I saw 3 men in white shirts and slim ties stepping out of a shiny black SUV. Their shoes were spotless, even though the ranch road was always muddy. Eric waved them in, his voice loud. "Welcome to Redwood Hill, the new star of Jackson County." The word star fell to the ground like a cold coin. I wiped my hands on my apron, holding my breath. Sabrina lightly touched my elbow. "Dad, tonight, there are a few extra guests from Eric. They just want to take a look." I asked, "Take a look at what?" She replied softly, "An opportunity." We sat down as the sun slid across the hillside, painting red over the wooden fence I'd reinforced through 3 snowstorms. Eric stood at the head of the table, a place that had been mine for many years, raised his glass of wine and smiled with intention. 30 years of Redwood Hill," he said, "and the start of 30 more. You just need to sign, Dad, and I'll handle the rest. Your time is over." The words dropped onto the steaming roast like a stone thrown into hot iron. Neighbors glanced at one another, some frowning, some forcing polite smiles. The 3 strangers beside Eric nodded slightly, setting down folders with a sun-orange logo, Suncor Renewables. I placed my glass back on its coaster, keeping my tone steady. "Sign what?" Eric gestured, and one of the Suncor men opened a laptop, setting up a portable projector right on the lawn. The hills seemed to darken as the white screen rose. The first slide showed the Suncor logo. Beneath it the words, "Land Use Optimization, Redwood Hill Ranch." They talked about yield rates, carbon credits, and how to turn a sleeping asset into an active cash flow. One neighbor chuckled when the word legacy slid across the screen and was replaced by leverage. Wordplay, accidental or not, I couldn't tell. Only that Eric's smile stretched long like a fishing line. "Total offer for 80 acres of western land. 950,000, said the salt-haired man, tapping the remote. "Includes panel infrastructure, access roads, and community support." He said support, but I heard exchange. I looked at Sabrina. My daughter stayed silent, her fingers spinning her wedding ring in reverse. "The western land," I said, "has the deep well and—" I stopped. No need to explain. Everyone here knew where Martha's grave was, under the century-old cypress, where the wind never missed an appointment. Eric cut in, his voice slick as oil. "It can be moved, Dad. The well can be re-drilled. Everything can be optimized. He flipped to the next slide, my hand-drawn ranch map, now digitized, blue grid lines crossing like a chessboard, red flags marking points, array A, array B, inverter pad. He tossed a printed copy onto the table. The paper slid, its corner hitting the plate edge, smearing black ink over the photo of our cattle I'd printed for the dinner program cover. The dairy age is dead, Eric laughed. Now it's energy. Someone chuckled, the sound high and hollow, like an empty bottle. Sabrina bent down, pretending to pick something up. I pulled the map back, smoothing its folds. The boundary lines I'd measured with hemp rope and sunlight had become polygons of color. I wondered if they could hear the well water when the first drop hit the iron bucket, or if to them, water was just a flow rate and pumping cost. Eric raised the remote. A valuation chart appeared. Land, $950K. Equipment, Suncor's responsibility. Family net, $950 minus tax, 12% credit, roughly $800 and plus. Think about it, Dad. At your age, cash is better than old cattle. He turned to the neighbors. Am I wrong? One shrugged, another whistled. The Suncor men stayed silent, their professional smiles pasted on. I'm not selling, I said, to the grass and to the hill, more than to them. Not that part of the land, Eric waved his hand. You always know. This whole county's stuck in the 90s because of people like you. He clicked one more slide, bold black letters on white. The problem, an old, stubborn holdout. I heard a soft gasp. Sabrina lifted her head, her lips trembling for a moment before dropping again. Anger surged through my chest like an old bull at the end of mating season, but I kept it penned in. Eric, I said, on the land you call optimized, I buried the woman who taught me never to back down from the wind. You say relocate, so tell me, where do you relocate memories? He laughed and shrugged. Memories don't pay the bills. The gray-haired man from Suncor cleared his throat gently, as if warning not to push further. Eric ignored him, turned fully toward me, and said in a low, final tone, You just need to sign, Dad. Your time is over. I stood up. The wooden chair made a short, crisp sound, like a carpenter's knife sliding along the grain in the right direction. Night had fallen, and the projector was the only light source, casting my shadow across the barn door, long, slightly bent at the shoulders of 66 years, but feet planted firm like the fence posts I'd driven on the first day. You call me a problem, I said, because you can't tell the difference between someone guarding the boundary and someone blocking the way. The boundary was here before you ever arrived. One of the neighbors, old Hank from down the slope, cleared his throat. Eric, take it easy. This ranch, we've all lived off it for many winters. Eric gave a polite smile, offering Hank an easy way out. I'm thinking of everyone, sir. School taxes are up, water costs are rising. Solar power helps the community. I looked at the screen where the word community flashed large like a campaign sign. 30 years ago, when I poured the foundation of this house, community was 4 neighbors lending a hand, 1 box of nails, 2 stew pots, and a bunch of kids running around. No slides, just sweat and breath. Sabrina moved halfway around the table, reaching for my hand, then froze. My daughter, the one who used to sit behind me on horseback, arms around my waist, laughing like silver bells, now stood between 2 sides, afraid to step across. I saw in her eyes the unease of someone who understood too late, but feared the storm. I didn't blame her then, I just felt cold. Eric checked his watch, then threw the map again, harder this time. The paper spun and landed on the table near a guest's red wine glass. A drop splashed onto the section labeled Wellhead. I pulled the paper back, dabbed the wine with my fingertip, and dried it with the edge of the tablecloth. No one spoke, but I knew they were watching. The 3 Suncor men exchanged glances. One leaned over and quickly switched the slide from old, stubborn holdout to an image of gleaming solar panels. The night went still, like the surface of a well just after the bucket breaks through. I adjusted my collar and spoke loud enough for all to hear. You think I'm old? But don't forget, I poured the foundation of this house, and I still have the original plans. I pointed toward the glass cabinet inside, the craft paper roll tied with hemp string on the second shelf, edges yellowed, but ink still bold. Tomorrow, if we talk about the future, we'll do it based on something called boundaries and ownership. But tonight, if this is supposed to be a celebration, don't turn dinner into a boardroom. Eric pressed his lips together, his smile dull like a blunt knife scraping orange peel. You've been stubborn all your life. He was about to continue when a gust swept through, snuffing out a few candles. Half the table fell into shadow. From the far pasture came the low, slow call of a cow. I picked up the fallen fork, set it back on the plate, and turned away. My steps on the wooden floor rang dry. 3 beats to the door, 1 down to the ground. Cool earth touching my heel. I didn't slam the door. I just closed it gently, like shutting a notebook, tight enough to keep the wind from flipping pages, loose enough to let the house breathe. Crossing the yard, I looked back. The screen still glowed, its image trembling in the wind as if trying to escape the frame and run toward the hills. Beyond it, the cypress trees stood still, long-time witnesses. I turned left toward the barn. I wasn't hungry. I wanted to hear the cows breathe, smell warm hay, and listen to the wood expand in the cool air, things that exist without anyone's signature. At the barn door, I laid my hand on the latch, feeling the familiar grain beneath my calloused palm. Above, the first star flickered. In my shirt pocket, the small notebook I always carried pressed against my chest. I pulled it out, opened to a blank page, and wrote, slowly, Redwood Hill, 30 years. Tonight, they called me a problem. Tomorrow, I'll show them the difference between a problem and a man who guards the line. I set the pen down, hearing the sound of ink meeting paper. Out in the field, the wind shifted. I lifted my head, catching the scent of water from the distant well, the faint iron of the bucket, the earth opening after a hot day. Scents that had carried me through half a lifetime. I thought of Martha, of the stone under the cypress, of her words the night we poured the porch slab. When the time comes, Harold, don't shout. Measure twice, then cut. I smiled for the first time that long night. All right, love, I'll measure twice. And in my mind, I began measuring everything again. The boundaries, the deeds, the well, the grave, and the quiet gaps between father and daughter. Wind passed through the barn, nudging the oil lamp flame. I blew it out. The night wrapped around me like an old coat. Fitted, knowing which shoulder was worn, which pocket held what. In that silence, I heard Justice inhale. Tomorrow, it would speak. Rain poured down. The first storm of the season drummed against the metal roof of the main house, like a rhythm of humiliation. I left the dinner early and walked across the field in the rain. The downpour grew heavy, the smell of red soil rising thick and raw. Streaks of lightning tore across the sky, flashing over the fences I had built with my own hands. I just needed to walk, to cool my head, to reach the cattle barn where the breathing of the Angus herd was steady, like the old heartbeat of this ranch. I stood there a while, running my hand along the back of the lead cow. It looked at me with calm, warm eyes that asked for nothing. I exhaled, then turned back toward the main house. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, I sensed something strange. The doorknob was icy cold, the hallway light glinting off a shiny new lock. I bent down. It was true. The lock had been changed. Sawdust clung to the doorframe, the air sharp with fresh metal. They had replaced the lock right after I walked away from the table. I tried turning the handle. It didn't move. The old key in my pocket was now useless. The rain came harder, stinging my face. I stood there for a few seconds, not knocking, not calling anyone's name. The lights were still on inside, so they were awake. But if I had to beg to enter the house, I poured the foundation for with my own hands. Then tonight, I'd rather stay with the cattle. I turned toward the barn. The air was thick with the smell of dry hay, warm hide, and rain. The Angus lay quietly, flinching now and then at the flashes outside. I grabbed an old blanket from a hook, spread it over the straw, and sat down. The rain hammered harder, dripping through the roof and onto my shoulder. I pulled my coat tight and looked around. This was where I used to sleep during calving season, and Martha would bring me dinner, teasing, "You love this barn more than the house." Now I was truly here, and that house no longer had a place for me. I opened the wooden chest by the wall. Inside was the expense ledger from 1994, the year we started the ranch. Each page held a part of our life: the cost of breeding stock, fence repairs, Martha's notes in red pen, "Don't forget to pay Hank for the hay." I flipped a few more pages and found an old document folded inside. Printed on it, Redwood Hill Ranch LLC ownership split. Harold 70%, Sabrina 20%, Eric 10%. I stared at the numbers, and it all became clear. They were setting up the paperwork to make it official. Once I signed to sell, the voting control would shift. The ranch would no longer be mine. No shouting, no court, just legal. A lightning flash cut across the hill, lighting up the wooden wall and bouncing off the barn door. For an instant, I saw the distant cypress grove, the one sheltering Martha's stone marker. Rain blew in through the gap, wetting the corner of the ledger. I closed it, but the words she once wrote came alive in memory. "If they forget your work, don't shout. Write everything down." I sat up, took my pen, and began to write. Every expense, every tax renewal, every storm season. In the margin, I added a small line: "The night they humiliated me in front of strangers." Martha's voice came back, warm and steady. "Don't shout, Harold. They'll expose their own noise." I paused, smiled faintly. Outside, the rain on the roof sounded like a clock ticking down to a change of power. I stood, pulled on my coat, and opened the barn door. The wind hit my face, thick with earth and manure. I walked to the well, the one Martha and I dug 30 years ago. The water was dark and deep, reflecting the last fading bolt. I looked down, my reflection blurred in the ripples. Amid the wind, I thought I heard a whisper: "Hold your line, Harold." I nodded softly. Back in the barn, I set the ledger on the wooden table beside Martha's photo, which I kept in my wallet. The rain still beat outside, but my mind was calm. The sting of shame was there, but beneath it was something else: clarity. When you're locked out of your own house, you learn two things: who's really with you, and that paperwork matters more than promises. I picked up the pen again and wrote one final note. "Tomorrow morning, First Cascade Bank. Verify records, ownership, signatures." Then I closed the book, tucked it in the leather pouch, and placed it under my head as a pillow. I lay down, hearing the low moose through the night. The wind carried in the scent of wet grass, and the oil lamp flickered like a slow breath. I closed my eyes, thinking of Martha, of lightning flashing over her stone, of her words: "Justice doesn't die, Harold. It just waits for the rain to wash the dust away." I don't know if I slept an hour or 3, only that when the rooster crowed, I woke with a steady heartbeat. Outside, the rain had stopped. The well stood still in the morning mist, and I knew one thing for certain. Today my justice would begin at the bank, not with shouting, but with my own signature. Dawn broke, dew still clinging to the fence line. I walked from the cattle barn up to the porch of the main house, my jacket still damp and streaked with mud. The new lock gleamed in the sunlight as if proud of its betrayal. I knocked. Eric opened the door, wearing a white shirt and holding a cup of coffee. The cheap cologne he wore overpowering the familiar scent of old wood. He looked me up and down, then smirked. "No need to knock, Dad. The new lock's there to keep the barn smell out of the house." I met his eyes, my voice hoarse but steady. "I'll ask again. Who permitted you to change the lock?" He leaned against the doorframe, sipping his coffee like a man comfortable in someone else's home. Did you forget? This is the property of Redwood Hill Ranch, LLC, and I'm a managing member. I'm just protecting company assets. I replied slowly, that asset took me 30 years of sweat. No one has. The right to lock me out of it? He let out a thin laugh. 30 years, yeah. 30 years of no change. Same cows, same grass, same old wooden house, same old man stuck in the past. Who do you think you are? John Wayne? The words hit like a slap. I heard light footsteps behind him. Sabrina stepped out, her hair tousled, still in her nightgown. She whispered, "Stop it, Eric." But he raised a hand. "No, let me finish. I'm tired of the act. The whole martyr routine. You talk about sacrifice, but this ranch isn't even worth that much. I'm just trying to save it from dying with you." I clenched my fists, the chill in my neck spreading to my shoulders. "By throwing me out of my own house?" He shrugged, tone dripping with mockery. "You make it sound funny. This house is owned by the LLC, not you. If you want to stay, you can rent a room. I'll even make it official. $500 a month, utilities included." Sabrina froze. "Eric!" But he turned and sneered. "I'm kidding. If he'd rather sleep with the cows, it's cheaper." I stayed silent. In that moment, I couldn't hear the birds or the wind, just the sound of my heartbeat, slow and solid like a hammer striking wood. I looked around, the door, the steps, the window frames, all things I had built, now props for a humiliation scene. I stepped onto the porch, meeting his gaze. "You think I'm old, you think I'm foolish, but there's something you don't know. I still have the original plans of this house, and the original always outranks the copy." Both of them went quiet. Sabrina lowered her head. Eric set down his coffee, avoiding my eyes. I turned away, my voice low but clear. "If you plan to take this ranch, keep it for one more night. Tomorrow morning I'll start measuring every inch, every tax dollar, every piece of paper." I stepped off the porch, mud squelching under my boots. Behind me, Eric called out, half laughing, "Whatever you say, Dad. But you should know, no one respects the stubborn anymore. They only respect people who sell at the right time." I didn't turn around. "Thanks for the lesson, Eric. I'll remember it, and use it when it's time to settle accounts." I walked across the yard. The early sun cut through the mist, glinting off the shiny lock. The light hit my eyes, bright enough to burn white, but I didn't blink. Because sometimes, to truly see who's betrayed you, you have to let the light hit you straight on. Morning mist blanketed the hills, the ground still wet from the night's storm, the sun not yet fully risen, silver light spilling across the wooden fence. I drove my old Ford down to Medford, straw still clinging to the seat. The road was familiar, yet this morning it felt strange. Every sign, every gas station I passed seemed to stand still, watching me go. It's a feeling that comes only once in a lifetime, when a man knows he's about to touch the truth, no matter how ugly it is. First Cascade Bank opened at 8. I parked beneath the old oak, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. The red brick building stood silent, glass doors reflecting my image, gray jacket, mud-stained boots. The elderly guard at the door recognized me and nodded. "Mornin', Mr. Quinn. Been a while." I said, "Yeah, I only come down when it matters." Inside, the bank smelled the same, paper and morning coffee. I headed straight for James Thornton's office, the longtime manager who had helped me set up Redwood Hill Ranch, LLC, back in 1994. He looked older, hair whiter, but he knew me instantly. "Harold! God, how many years? Still holding the ranch?" I nodded, my voice rough. "Holding, yes, but someone's trying to take it. I need to see every company file, originals, scans, and any recent submissions." Thornton frowned. "All right, but what's going on?" I replied quietly. "Family business, except it's not private anymore." He led me to the records room and pulled up the database. Each line glowed on the screen, year, date, file ID. I stared until he stopped at the newest entry. Proposal, Land Redevelopment, Suncor Renewables. Submitted by Eric Dalton. I asked him to print it. The sheet slid from the printer, ink still warm. The first line froze me. On behalf of Redwood Hill Ranch LLC, we agreed to preliminary terms. Below it, only one signature, Eric Dalton, managing partner, acting. No signature of mine, no authorization line. Thornton read it, his expression darkening. Harold, this isn't valid, but to outsiders it'll look like you approved. I nodded slightly. Enough to fool an investor, right? He sighed. Exactly. If Suncor announces a preliminary deal, they can claim advance funding, and it'll be held to prove you didn't consent. I held the papers, the smell of fresh ink sharp in my nose. I need copies of everything, I said. Thornton understood, ordering staff to print duplicates. Original deed, tax rolls, 2022 through 2024, financial reports, LLC ownership records, and account activity logs. I sat there, listening to the steady hum of the printer, pages falling into the tray like heartbeats. Each one was a piece of this ranch's blood, mine, Martha's, and all the winters we burned fence posts for heat. When the stack reached about an inch thick, I gathered it carefully into a black binder. Inside the cover, I labeled it by hand. Evidence. Redwood Hill Ranch. Alongside the documents, I added a photo I'd taken last year of the cypress grove, the stone marker for Martha's grave, GPS coordinates printed at the bottom, 42.2987 north, 122.8371 west. Beneath it, I wrote, Justice begins here. Thornton stood quietly. You planning to sue? I answered, no, not yet. I just need to keep the proof before they erase it. He nodded. If you need a witness for the records, I'm in. We shook hands firmly, and I left just as the clock struck 10. On the drive back, the wind swept across the soggy cornfields, damp air flooding the truck. I stopped at the old gas station, bought a coffee and a small USB drive. By the time I reached the ranch, the sun was up, and the wet ground shimmered like it had been washed clean. In the workshop, I brushed dust off the table and opened my old laptop. One by one, I photographed each page, numbered them. 001 deed, 002 bank record, 003 LLC split, 004 photo of grave. When I was done, I saved the folder as evidence, one eyes HR. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, casting a long stripe across the desk. I sat still, listening to the slow spin of the fan, my hand resting on the USB like it was the heartbeat of justice itself. Something had awakened in me, not anger, but resolve. They could call me an outdated old man, but they forgot. Men like me live by records, not by promises. I pulled out my phone and found the number for Abigail Raines, Martha's old friend, now a land attorney. The phone rang 3 times before her familiar calm voice answered, quick and steady. Harold? After all these years? I said. Abby, it's time you looked at this land again. Not just land, but a promise to Martha. Silence for a few seconds, and then she replied, I'll come. Bring everything. I hung up and looked out at the field. The cattle were scattered under the afternoon light, rain droplets still clinging to their backs, sparkling like Martha's old necklace. I smiled faintly and said to myself, All right, love, I've started writing it down, and this time they'll have to read every last line. The next afternoon, the sky cleared crystal blue after 2 days of rain. Sunlight slanted through the cypress grove, glinting off the barn wall like metal. I sat in the workshop, the binder labeled Evidence. Redwood Hill Ranch, neatly placed on the table. Around 4:30, a silver-gray Subaru stopped at the gate. The door opened and Abigail Raines stepped out. Brown leather jacket, hair tied back, eyes sharp yet familiar. It had been over 10 years since Martha's death, but I still recognized her stride. Quick, purposeful, the kind of woman who carried a plan with every step. Harold, she called, her voice low and steady. I knew from your tone on the phone this was serious. Let me see the binder. I slid it toward her. Abigail sat down and opened it, scanning each page with the precision of someone who never missed a detail. When she reached the member resolution, Redwood Hill Ranch, LLC, her brow furrowed, and her hand paused on the signature line. "Harold," she said quietly, "this signature, it's not yours." I answered, "No, I never signed it. I've never seen that page before." She pulled out her glasses and examined the ink closely. "This is a forgery. They copied your old signature from a bank file and pasted it. Amateur work, but convincing to anyone who doesn't look close." She took her pen and wrote a sharp note in the margin. "Fraudulent member resolution. 18 USC. Pantofartmond, Titrest for 1. I sat silent for a moment, then said honestly, "Abby, I slept in the barn last night." She looked up fast. "You what?" I told her everything. The dinner, the pressure to sign, the rain, the new lock gleaming on my own door, the light still on inside while no one opened it. I stood there in the rain, staring at my own lock, feeling like a stranger. I said. Abigail set down her pen, her eyes lit with anger. "You're telling me they changed the locks while you're still living there?" I nodded. She spoke slowly and firmly. "That's an unlawful detainer. They crossed the line. Do you want me to draft a notice to vacate right now?" I looked up. "You can do that." She nodded. "Absolutely. You own 70%, and they've illegally excluded you from your own property. I'll file a temporary restraining order, a TRO, forcing them out within 7 days. You'll be back in your house." I sat still, coffee cooling in my hand. "What about Eric?" Abigail didn't hesitate. "For every forged signature or false filing, the court can issue civil fines up to $25,000, and coercion against an elder can go criminal." She handed me the freshly printed sheet. The header read, "Notice to vacate. Unlawful occupancy." I read each word slowly, the scent of fresh ink mixing with the faint hay on my jacket. When the pen touched paper, I signed clearly, Harold Quinn, the red seal of Rains and Associates, stamped beside it with a dry final thud like a judge's gavel. Abigail watched me for a long moment, her tone softer. "Don't get angry, Harold. Anger clouds evidence. Keep your head cold. Let them fear your silence." I nodded steady. "I'm not angry, Abby. I'm just remeasuring the line." She smiled faintly. "That sounds just like Martha." I said, "She taught me that. Measure twice, cut once. It's time for the cut." As dusk settled, Abigail packed her case, but her phone rang. She listened briefly, then handed it to me. "Sheriff Foster wants a word." His voice came deep and firm. "I've received the order, Mr. Quinn. Tomorrow morning at 7:30, I'll execute it at the ranch. Have your copies ready?" I replied simply, "I'll be here." When the call ended, the last of the sunset stretched over the cypress grove, the air carrying the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. I stood on the porch, staring toward the main house. The new lock caught the fading light, gleaming like a blade. I murmured to myself, "Last night I slept in the barn. Tomorrow the law walks through that door." Abigail was quiet for a moment, then said, "Walk with me before dark." We followed the fence line, boots sinking into damp grass, the horizon glowing like honey spilled across the field. She stopped at an old plank where 2 letters were carved faintly. Q plus M, 1994. She brushed her fingers over it. "Martha carved this?" I nodded. "Yeah, the day we built the first fence. I told her just to drive the posts, but she said we needed a mark, so the land would know who loved it." Abigail smiled, the last light turning her hair copper. "Beautiful," she said softly. Then her tone deepened. "Harold, you realize this isn't just about land. It's about reclaiming the boundary between respect and betrayal." I answered slowly, "I know, and tomorrow that line gets measured again." We walked back as darkness thickened, mist rising over the pasture. Abigail started her car and glanced at me through the window. "Stay silent. Let them hear the law, not you." I nodded. Her taillights faded beyond the pines. I stood alone on the porch, the air cool with hay and rain. On that old plank, the carved Q plus M caught the starlight like a vow. Justice doesn't need to shout. just one signature drawn true along the line. The next morning, the air still smelled of last night's rain. The ground glistened under early sunlight, thick with the scent of wet soil and trampled grass. Sheriff Foster arrived right at 7:30, his beige pickup crunching gravel as it turned through the ranch gate. I stood on the porch, the binder labeled Evidence, Redwood Hill Ranch in my hands, and the shiny new lock, the one that had humiliated me, was now just another piece of evidence. Foster stepped out, adjusted his hat, his voice steady and firm as a gavel. By order of Jackson County, all unlawful occupancy must cease immediately. The rightful possessor is entitled to full restoration of the main residence. He turned to Eric and Sabrina. They stood on the porch, faces stiff, silent. Sabrina hid behind her husband, Eric's neck flushed red, veins showing. Across the road, a few neighbors stopped to watch, shading their eyes, their expressions a mix of curiosity and pity. No one spoke. Only the wind moved and the rustle of paper as Foster handed over the order. "Mr. Dalton," he said evenly, "you have 24 hours to remove your belongings and vacate the main house. If you're still here by tomorrow morning, I'll return with an enforcement team." Eric let out a bitter laugh. "Incredible. The old man sleeps in a barn one night and thinks he's some kind of hero. You should be grateful we even let you stay on this rotten dirt patch." He took a step closer, jabbing a finger at me. "You're destroying your own future. This could have been $1 million project. What do you know about the modern world? Cows, fences, dirt, all relics." I stayed silent. Foster shifted slightly, his hand resting on his holster, a small, deliberate warning. "Mr. Dalton," he said coldly, "this is an active enforcement site. One more insult, and I'll record you for obstruction." Eric clenched his jaw, muscles twitching. He lowered his voice, but spat each word. "You'll regret this, Harold. You can have the house back, but you'll never have your dignity. Everyone sees you now for what you are. An old fool living on pity." I replied slowly, not looking at him. "Dignity doesn't need to be given, Eric. It only disappears when a man sells it." The words froze him. Silence hung heavy, broken only by wind through the fence and the distant chime of cowbells. Sabrina wiped her tears but said nothing. Foster handed me a duplicate of the order, meeting my eyes. "I'll check back tomorrow, Harold. For now, this ranch is legally yours again." I nodded, voice low but steady. "Thank you, Sheriff. I don't want anyone thrown out. I just want fairness returned to where it belongs." Eric yanked a suitcase and slammed it into the truck bed with a metallic crash. He spat on the ground and shouted before driving off. "Keep your damn farm. We'll see who laughs last." The air was filled with exhaust and the bitter smell of burnt rubber. I watched in silence as the haze drifted away, sunlight catching on the binder in my hand. Foster studied me for a moment, nodded and left. I turned toward the house, the same new lock hanging there, reflecting cold light. I whispered almost to myself, "Last night I slept in the barn. Tonight the law sleeps in the house." The next morning, Sheriff Foster returned with 2 deputies. The fields were soaked with dew. He read the order aloud one final time, his tone calm but unyielding. Eric shot me a venomous look and muttered, "You'll regret this, old man." I said nothing, holding Martha's old hat in my hand. Sabrina quietly entered the house, packing in silence, clothes, a wedding photo, and the wall clock. Neighbors gathered along the fence, mute. The sounds that remained were the thud of suitcases, the creak of doors, and gravel under tires. Eric tossed the last bag into the trunk, started the engine, and sped off, the smell of gasoline lingering in the cool morning. His eyes were red, but I didn't move. I just watched the truck disappear around the bend of the same dirt road I had once leveled myself. When it was gone, Foster came up and nodded. "From this moment, the main house is yours again." I nodded back, my hands trembling slightly. The shiny lock now sat sealed inside his evidence bag. I slid my old key into the newly replaced lock and heard a soft click. the sound small but louder to me than any courtroom gavel. Inside, the scent of old wood and faint coffee lingered. Sunlight fell across the photo of Martha and me hanging in the hallway. I touched the frame gently. "I'm home, Martha," I whispered, this time by law. That noon, Hank, my neighbor from down the slope, drove up. He held out his phone, hesitant. "Harold, have you seen this?" I frowned. On his screen was a Facebook post from Eric Dalton. The headline, "Read When Fathers Block the Future." Redwood Hill Ranch, stuck in the 90s. Below it, a photo of me sitting in the barn during that rainy night, lamplight dim on half my face, the rest swallowed in shadow. The caption read, "King of Dirt." I froze for a few seconds. That was the night he'd secretly taken the photo while I sat drenched and humiliated. Now it was a joke for the public. The comments were full of laughing emojis and mockery. "Old stubborn man, boomer farmer, king of mud, nailed it." The Medford Herald had already reposted it under generational conflict at a Southern Oregon ranch. Sabrina was tagged. She didn't comment, didn't defend, didn't delete. Her silence hurt more than all the words combined. I stared at the screen a long time, then turned it off. No reply. No need. That afternoon, I sat in the workshop documenting everything. The post, the comments, the timestamps. I plugged in a new USB labeled Evidence to RHR and saved each file. Every time I clicked save, the mouse made a faint sound like a nail being driven into a coffin. Not mine, but his. I emailed Abigail the evidence with a short subject line: defamation and misrepresentation. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. Her voice was calm but edged with steel. "I've seen it. This qualifies for defamation and false representation. Don't delete anything. I'll have the court subpoena the platform for originals." I said, "I'm not deleting a thing. I just want them to understand. This time my silence isn't forgetting. It's recording." That night, I sat alone in the workshop. The yellow light pooled over the table. The blue glow of my phone screen reflected in my eyes. I looked at that image of myself, the man sitting in the barn, soaked, silent, but still alive. I smiled faintly and whispered, "Let them laugh, Abby. The loudest voices always belong to the ones about to lose." Outside, the wind brushed the fence, and the cowbells chimed softly. In the workshop, the blue light trembled across the wood, quiet and sharp, like a blade just cooled from the forge. Harold sat before the USB, the lamplight catching his eyes, silent as steel. The next morning, Abigail sent me a PDF file with a short subject line: Injunction, Redwood Hill Ranch. She had filed a petition with the county court for a temporary order blocking any sale, mortgage, or transfer related to the ranch until the defamation and unlawful occupancy cases were fully resolved. The injunction took effect immediately. The bank, the tax office, and even Suncor Energy were all notified. By noon, the dominoes had started to fall. Eric received the first email from North Cascade Credit Union. "Your credit account is currently under pending litigation. All new business loan applications will be denied until legal disputes are settled." He called Sabrina, yelling into the phone from a parking lot, "He's destroying our lives. He wants me to starve." Less than an hour later, I heard an engine roar outside the gate. A silver Chevy skidded to a stop, tires screeching, smoke curling upward. Eric jumped out, hair a mess, eyes bloodshot. He shouted, "What the hell are you doing, Harold? You want the whole town to think I'm a thief? You're killing your daughter's future." I said nothing. I just pulled out my phone, switched to video, and aimed the lens straight at him. My voice stayed calm. "You're being recorded. Everything you say will go to my attorney." He stepped back, still seething. "You'll regret this. No one's on your side." I watched him drive off, dust swirling in the wind. The smell of exhaust mixed with damp grass, a heavy scent, the smell of endings. By late afternoon, my inbox lit up again. An email from Suncor Energy LLC read, We are suspending all negotiations and cooperation with Dalton Development, pending verification of legal ownership for Redwood Hill Ranch. I finished reading and smiled faintly. This land knows who's true, I said quietly. That night, the air was still. I took a flashlight and a bag of new wooden stakes and walked the perimeter of the ranch. With each post, I drove into the soil. I carved the mark, Q, 25, with my pocket knife. Q for quiet, the silence that had become my weapon. The sound of the wooden mallet echoed through the night, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of land coming back to life after being trampled. I stopped by the eastern fence, watching moonlight spill over the field, and whispered, "Everything will be measured again, not with words, but with marks that stay." 3 days after the court approved the injunction, Abigail called me, her voice low but clear. "Harold, I think we just opened a much bigger door." She sent over an email attachment titled Dalton Development LLC. Transaction Records 2022-2025. The first line made my breath catch. Recurring withdrawals of $2,400 every month for 3 straight years, transferred from the company account to a personal account under the same name, Eric Dalton. No descriptions, no invoices, no legal documentation. Abigail said, "I've contacted the CPA for Jackson County. They've agreed to initiate a forensic audit. Every transaction will be traced back to the company's founding. If confirmed, this won't just be property misuse, it's potential federal tax fraud." That afternoon, we met at the accounting office in downtown Medford. Sunlight poured through the glass windows, glinting across a wooden table covered with statements, columns, and signatures. I put on my glasses, reading each line slowly until one entry stopped me cold. March, $2,400. Note, personal expense. My voice came out rough. Every month he took $2,400, the same amount that could have paid my granddaughter's entire quarterly tuition at Medford Academy, enough to buy her a new pair of shoes instead of patching the old ones. He told my daughter the family budget was tight, that they needed to cut back, while my own money was being drained through his hands, month after month. I stopped, staring at the numbers, cold, fixed, like nails hammered into truth. Behind every number lies a lie. Abigail stayed silent, just resting her hand on the file, her eyes saying what words didn't need to. I exhaled slowly, picked up the pen, and signed the authorization page with a firm, heavy stroke. "Take it to court whenever it's time." She nodded, gathering the files. "I'll handle the evidence and tax correspondence. You keep your ground, Harold. The numbers are speaking for you now." When I stepped outside, the sky had turned gray. The wind swept hard across the distant fields, lifting dust and dry grass. It howled through the wire fence like a warning. A storm was coming, and this time it carried the truth. 3 weeks after the forensic audit, Abigail decided it's time to bring everything into the light. She rented Redwood Hall, the old community building in the center of town that used to host agricultural meetings. The wooden sign still hung on the wall, its faded letters reading, "For those who work the land honestly." That Friday afternoon, the whole town of Medford buzzed. Nearly 100 people gathered outside Redwood Hall. Farmers, neighbors, reporters from the Medford Herald, a few people from the bank, even representatives from Suncor Energy. Everyone had heard the rumors that the old man thrown out by his son-in-law was about to show proof. For weeks, the Redwood Valley had been murmuring about the man who had to sleep in his barn because his locks were changed. When we walked in, all eyes turned toward me, the man in the worn brown coat holding a thick evidence binder. I heard someone whisper, "That's the old man his own son-in-law kicked out on that rainy night." Another shook their head in pity. A woman in the front row said softly, "So it was true." Abigail stepped up to the podium, her voice clear and steady. "We are not here today to repeat rumors," she said, "but to see truth through evidence. These are the official records of Redwood Hill Ranch, LLC, and what was done to exploit it." She signaled for me to start the projector. The first image appeared, a video of Eric shouting outside the ranch gate, raging and cursing, his voice booming, "You're a roadblock! Outdated trash! Get out of my house!" The footage showed him ripping out the lock, throwing the key to the ground and walking back inside as rain hammered the tin roof. My voice could be heard faintly calling out, unanswered. The hall fell silent. One woman covered her mouth, a few men shook their heads, and the Suncor representative sat frozen, speechless. Then Abigail displayed the side-by-side comparison of signatures, the real one and the forged one. One wavered naturally, the other too flat, too clean. She pointed, "Forgery of corporate documents, violating 18 U.S.C., Tone 14 and Paragraph 341. This is no longer a family dispute. It's a federal offense." The room grew dense with quiet. Then she projected the bank statements from the last 3 years, the numbers glowing cold under the white light. I stepped forward, my voice slow but firm. "This is money from the company I founded. He withdrew it every month for 3 years. $2,400 each time, enough to pay my granddaughter's tuition at Medford Academy, enough for a new pair of shoes so she wouldn't have to patch the old ones. While I was thrown out of my own home, sleeping in a barn, my money was feeding his luxury." The hall went completely still. A cameraman lowered his camera, unable to record another frame. Abigail then held up the letter from Suncor Energy. "We are suspending all cooperation with Dalton Development until ownership of Redwood Hill Ranch is verified," she said. "That means every involved party has confirmed the ranch was taken through falsified documents." From the third row, Sabrina broke down in tears, her voice trembling. "I didn't know he did this. I swear I didn't know." I looked directly at her, the white light cutting across half my face like steel. "You knew," I said quietly. "You just didn't want to see." Eric jumped up, shouting, "It's all lies," and lunged toward the door. But Sheriff Foster, who had been standing silently at the back of the whole time, stepped forward, his tone deep and final. "Eric Dalton, you are under arrest by order of the Jackson County Court for forgery and unlawful appropriation of property." The sound of handcuffs snapped through the hall. The metal door closed behind them. The lights glared across the room, reflecting on the faces of the farmers, silent but their eyes bright. Outside, the low rumble of cattle echoed across the fields, heavy and long, like the earth itself finally speaking after years of silence. I looked around the hall and understood what Martha once told me. Justice doesn't need to shout, it just needs to land where it belongs. 2 months after the community hearing, the case of Redwood Hill Ranch LLC went to public trial at the Jackson County Land Court. The courtroom was small, its dark wood walls catching the pale morning light that streamed through the window, falling across rows of benches packed with local townspeople. At the front, the bronze seal of justice hung high, gleaming under the warm lamps. On the plaintiff's side stood me and Abigail Raines. On the defense, Eric Dalton, his face drawn, suit wrinkled, eyes swollen from sleepless nights. Judge Mary Caldwell, who had presided over many land disputes, opened the session. "This case concerns ownership rights and corporate fraud. Everyone maintains order. We will hear the evidence." Abigail rose, her voice calm yet precise, every word measured, like steel against steel. "Your Honor, we submit the following evidence. The original deed of Redwood Hill Ranch, a notarized ownership amendment, under Mr. Harold Quinn's legal title, a signature comparison between authentic and forged documents, a video recording of the defendant, Eric Dalton, threatening and unlawfully entering the property, and a forensic audit report confirming unauthorized withdrawals spanning 3 years. She placed each exhibit on the wooden table, the sound of paper meeting wood echoing sharply through the silent room. Eric sat rigid, feigning composure, but his fingers kept tapping restlessly against his knee. When it was his turn, he stood, voice trembling, though he tried to sound firm. "Your Honor, he's an old man. He's not of sound mind anymore. I was simply acting under delegated authority. Abigail didn't argue. She quietly set down a medical report. The judge picked it up and read aloud. Local physician Dr. Thomas Weller certifies that Mr. Harold Quinn is fully lucid, capable of independent legal decision-making. Report filed 2 months prior, duly signed and sealed. A murmur swept through the gallery, then silence. Eric's head dropped, his face drained of color. The judge laid the papers aside and spoke in a tone low yet final. Defendant Eric Dalton is found guilty of forgery, fraudulent documentation, unlawful appropriation of assets, and misuse of fiduciary authority for personal gain. The court orders restitution of $86,400 and additional court costs of $9,200. Full ownership and managerial rights of Redwood Hill Ranch are hereby restored to Mr. Harold Quinn. The gavel struck, thud, a sound that rang through the room like a hammer, breaking the crust of injustice. I sat still, eyes closed, exhaling slowly, all the months of humiliation, exile, and contempt condensed into that single quiet moment. I felt no triumph, no rage, only a clear sense that everything had finally returned to where it belonged. Outside, sunlight poured through the window, spilling over the wooden floor like a ribbon of golden honey. I opened my eyes and saw Abigail glance over, giving a small nod. I understood. Justice had reached its peak. 3 weeks after the trial, the name Eric Dalton vanished from the local real estate registry, but it reappeared across every newspaper under the crime section. The Medford Herald ran a bold front-page headline, "From Broker to Forger, the Fall of Eric Dalton." Beneath it was a photo of him leaving the courthouse in handcuffs, his head bowed, his wrinkled suit drained of all arrogance. The Oregon State Licensing Board swiftly revoked his broker's license and blacklisted him for fraud. Within 2 weeks, Northwest Credit Bank issued a foreclosure notice on the house he once bragged was his own. The car was towed, the house padlocked. The entire town of Medford knew the man who once boasted about a new era of ranching was now living in a small rented apartment on the outskirts of Grants Pass. Sabrina, my daughter, collapsed completely. She filed for legal separation just 3 days after the verdict, leaving the house with nothing but her tarnished wedding ring and a few clothes. Inside the envelope she sent me was a single handwritten note, the shaky letters trembling on the page. "I chose the wrong man to trust." I read that line over and over. I felt no anger, no pity, only the heavy stillness of a storm passing outside my window. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and typed a short reply. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's remembering without hate. Then I hit send, leaned back, and listened to the rain tapping against the wooden frame like the heartbeat of the land. That afternoon I walked out into the fields. The rain cut cold against my skin, drops striking my hat and shoulders hard. Ahead, the cattle huddled beneath the row of cypress trees, their breath steaming in the chill air. I opened Sabrina's letter again, the paper damp, the ink running, merging with the rain. I couldn't tell which stains were from tears and which were from the sky. I looked up toward the new fence line, where the mark Q 2025 was carved. The wind moaned through the wood, deep and low like a prayer. I whispered, "Martha, our daughter has learned. As for him, let life be his teacher." In the middle of the storm, I stood still. Everything around me was soaked, but inside I felt strangely dry. The storm had passed. Justice had spoken, and what remained was only time, letting each person face the weight of their own choices. 6 months after the trial, spring returned to Medford. The hills glowed green after the rains, the grass so thick that every hoofprint left by the cattle looked like a carved signature on the skin of the earth. I stood by the old wooden fence, gazing north toward the 30-acre stretch, bordering the forest, the same land Martha and I had once planned to use for another cattle barn. But life changes, and I had come to understand that some things must be given away if you want the rest to stay whole. That morning, I signed the papers to sell that parcel to the Coastal Veteran Cooperative, a group founded by veterans to help those who had served but lost their livelihood. Price, $450,000 in cash. They promised to preserve the fence, the cypress trees, and the dirt road leading to the old well, the heritage of the man who built it. I nodded and signed without hesitation. I set aside $100,000 from the sale to establish the Martha Quinn Memorial Fund, a scholarship for farm children pursuing studies in livestock management and sustainable agriculture. In the foundation charter, I wrote a single line, because Martha believed land only truly lives when people tend it with both mind and heart. The signing took place in a small office at First Cascade Bank, the same place where all of this had once begun. Abigail was there, still in her brown leather coat, her expression steady as ever. When the notary pressed the final seal, she looked at me and smiled. "Harold," she said, "you did exactly what Martha would have wanted." I replied quietly but firmly, "I used to think justice needed to shout. Now I know it only needs the right signature." We stepped out onto the porch, the wind carrying the scent of new grass and the distant lowing of cattle. On the ranch gate, I hung a new oak sign carved with the words, "Redwood Hill Ranch, since 1994, reclaimed 2025. The afternoon sun caught the lettering, turning it the color of honey. I stood there for a long moment, feeling as if the land itself was breathing, lighter now, free of resentment. Martha once said, "The earth knows who keeps their promises." I laid my hand on the sign and smiled. For the first time in years, I felt the ranch was truly mine again, not just on paper, but in spirit. 1 year after the trial, summer returned to Redwood Hill Ranch. The sun spread gold across the hills, the wind carrying the scent of dry grass and warm soil. I had grown used to this quiet rhythm, early mornings with coffee, tending the cattle, watering the cypress trees by afternoon, and writing a few lines in my old notebook at night. After all the storms, life had finally circled back to something simple again. That evening, while I was repairing the southern fence, I heard the sound of a car at the gate. A silver SUV stopped. The door opened and Sabrina stepped out, her hair tied back, a white shirt, and eyes that had changed. It had been a long time since I last saw her. She looked older now, calmer, her gaze no longer cold or evasive. She stood still for a moment, then walked closer, her voice low and rough. "I came to help let the cattle out, if you'll let me." I looked at her for a long while, then nodded. "The east pen's open. Just let them go. They'll know their way." Father and daughter walked side by side along the fence as the cattle strolled into the pasture, the bells on their necks chiming softly into the wind. Neither of us spoke. All apologies and regrets had dissolved into the air. What remained was quiet understanding, like rain meeting the soil. When we finished, I asked her to stop by the western cypress grove, where Martha rested. I knelt, laid a bundle of dry grass tied with fresh straw, beside the headstone engraved with a new line. "We kept the land, Martha. Justice stood firm." I looked up as the sunset poured gold across the fields, the wooden fence glowing like it had been brushed with honey. The Q2025 posts I'd driven into the ground last year still stood tall, unmoved through every storm. Sabrina stood silently watching me. Tears fell, but there was a faint smile on her lips. The wind swept over the hill, and the cattle bells echoed long and low into the fading light. I breathed deep and whispered, to myself, to Martha, to the land. Justice doesn't need to plow deep, it only needs to be planted in the right place. Above us, the sun slipped behind the cypress trees. The ground that had once birthed all my pain now held the end of it, peaceful, steady, and alive. From that day on, Redwood Hill Ranch was more than land. It was proof of what I had spent a lifetime learning. True justice isn't for revenge, it's to keep the heart from decaying. If you've ever been driven out of the home you built with your own hands, ever slept in a barn because your own kin shut you out, ever been humiliated for holding to what's right, remember the story of Redwood Hill Ranch. Because justice doesn't need to shout or strike back. It only needs one person steady enough to stand until the truth finds its way home. If you believe that silence at the right moment can be stronger than 1,000 arguments, leave a single dot in the comments to let me know you still believe in justice. And if you want to hear more true stories like this, about ordinary people with unbreakable spirits, where truth always finds its way home, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because sometimes one story at the right moment is enough to help you rise again after all the wrongs.